I'm joined on the Crispin Flintoff show by Vanessa Beeley, journalist based in Lebanon. How are you doing, Vanessa?
I'm good, thank you. Fine.
You look a bit safer than you were when I spoke to you last, when you were leaving. We just left Syria. You look quite comfortable
Yeah,
there.
yeah, I'm a bit more relaxed now. I have a home, I have my dogs back. I'm a bit more with it, let's say. A bit more settled than I
Yeah, I
was when I
noticed
spoke to you.
when I interviewed you before, people seem to be a bit more worried about your dogs than anything else.
Well, I
Um,
can kind of understand that because I think I was a lot more worried about the dogs than about myself. Because they can't take care of themselves. But people will be very glad to know that three are rehomed and three are now here. The last one arrived uh 2 days ago, actually,
oh
the
wow,
pit bull.
that's soon, that recent. I mean, oh wow.
Yeah,
Um,
so they're all back with me now.
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask you to come. I want ask you to come on, mostly because I saw this uh, on your Substack, which
Mm,
I haven't seen anywhere else. Blair emerges on the Lebanon scene as, I like the way you use inverted commas, Israel escalates aggression on southern towns as Trump fails to disarm the regional resistance on behalf of so-called Israel. Blair is brought in to further pressure Lebanon to disarm the local resistance. Uh, he's also been mentioned with Gaza, the plan to whatever they're going to do in Gaza, and he's there. What do you make of this?
well, Blair is making his comeback, having put his protege into power, Keir Starmer, who of course is nothing more than a glove puppet for Blair and Blair policy in the region in particular. We've seen Blair now linked to the development of the so-called free trade zone in Gaza, which we know is a plan that has been in the making for decades, actually, to eradicate the Palestinian population, to facilitate Gaza becoming this so-called free trade zone with much smaller kind of concentration camp areas where they can keep the Palestinians for slave labor. I'm interpreting the plan, obviously, but this is clearly what they're heading towards. And then for Gaza to be a very important link, particularly with its gas reserves off the Gazan coast, in the India-Middle East economic corridor. And the fact that Blair has been involved in that plan is no surprise to those that have watched his career from being the war criminal involved in the decimation of Iraq, also, of course, in former Yugoslavia, which was largely the blueprint for what rolled out in this region. We've seen Starmer take on Jonathan Powell, who was formerly Blair's security advisor. Starmer adopted him just before the fall of Syria in December 2024. And then lo and behold, it comes out that Jonathan Powell was in fact involved in the rebranding of Jolani when he was still in Idlib, in control of the Al-Qaeda affiliates in Idlib that then were given power in Damascus. And Jonathan Powell headed up the organization called Intermediate that has now dispatched operatives to Damascus to coach and to train Jolani's henchmen into becoming the political entity in Damascus. Of course, they're not being very successful because the ongoing ethnic cleansing and massacres of Syrian minorities is not being addressed by any of these British entities under the control, ultimately, of Tony Blair. And now what we're seeing in Lebanon is the failure of the Trump regime, and particularly the economic hitman, as I call him, Tom Barrack, who had his hand in the first election of Trump, was involved in corruption between the Trump election and the UAE, in particular, lobbying the UAE to support Trump and then lobbying Trump to invest in the UAE. He's involved, of course, in the so-called investment in Syria, which is nothing more than an illusion of investment, just as we saw in post-2003 Iraq, where the US, Paul Bremer, was bringing in huge investment, none of which, of course, ever reached the people of Iraq. And the same thing now is happening in Syria. It's basically crony capitalism. Barrack will be pocketing a lot of the money that is being pledged by the likes of Saudi Arabia, UAE, but most of the companies are shell companies. They're not actual companies. I've actually done a pretty big investigation into this. And Blair is involved in all of this. Now, with the failure of Tom Barrack to bring the Lebanese government to heel and to force the Lebanese armed forces that are sponsored by the United States to effectively disarm Hezbollah and the other affiliated resistance factions in the south of Lebanon. Tony Blair is now being brought in as the kind of the backup to create this so-called international commission that is going to effectively steal Lebanese land in the south, so ethnically cleanse the people from an area of southern Lebanon, and to build, guess what, a free trade zone in that area, which will be under the direction of this international coalition, which means the theft of Lebanese territory, its occupation by the Zionists, and the use of the territory by Trump and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and so on, the entire Zionist bloc, as a free trade zone.
Wow.
Sorry,
I,
that was I was trying to condense an
no,
awful
I mean, it's
lot into.
incredible what you've just described. It's hard to take in everything you've just said. It just makes me think Tony Benn. It just makes me think Tony Blair is some sort of smiling. I can help you out of this intermediary who's brought in after the kind of violence of other
Yeah.
people, like a kind of good cop, bad cop. He's like the good guy. He'll sort you out. You know, when it's really bad, Tony Blair comes in as this rescue person. Is that sort of what's happening with
It's
Gaza, with
kind of
Lebanon?
what's happening, yes, but I think you also have to remember that everything that's happening in the region goes back to this collusion between the UK and the US. The British created the Zionist entity, the US adopted it. The British created Saudi Arabia and UAE and released the Saudi Ibn al-Saud Wahhabist doctrine onto other areas, the west and the north of Saudi Arabia, to cleanse them and to basically ensure the supremacy of the Wahhabi doctrine inside Saudi Arabia. And those entities were created in collaboration with the creation of the Zionist entity to provide protection and apologism in the region for the Zionist entity. Then what happened? The US adopted them. Right, and the US is leading the bulk of the defense agreements with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and keeping them afloat from a defense perspective in order that they remain in a protectionist role towards the Zionist entity. And then if you look at the Bush-Blair doctrine in Iraq, it was the communiques between Bush and Blair that demonstrated exactly how they were enforcing the Israeli clean break doctrine in the region, starting with Iraq and then going to Syria. Syria was so important for breaking the back of the resistance axis because it was, one, the main land bridge for weapons to come from Iran through West Asia and into Lebanon and Palestine. And secondly, most importantly, Syria was actually producing many of the weapons that are being used by the Palestinian resistance. So when Israeli intelligence were actually discussing kind of where to go next, they made the decision, no, we have to break Syria first rather than Lebanon. So now what's happening, you have a policy of isolationism and encirclement of the remaining resistance zones. So isolating Palestine from Hezbollah by creating the southern buffer zone, isolating Hezbollah from Iraq and Iran and even Yemen by breaking Syria. And we'll come back onto this because of the buildup of the US military presence and Israeli expansionism into Syria, increases that isolationism and encirclement of Hezbollah. Now Hegseth, the Minister of War for Trump, the President of War, not of peace, as he was elected on, is threatening Iraq that there will be a regional escalation. And if any of the resistance actors inside Iraq come to the help of whoever is involved in this escalation, he hasn't made it clear whether it's Yemen, Iran, Hezbollah, or all of them, then Iraq itself will be targeted. He's threatened the Minister of Defense in Iraq. So we're looking at now, as I said, the ice, because they couldn't break the unity of the resistance, right? Even with the fall of Syria, the resistance has continued here in Lebanon in support of Palestine. The Palestinian resistance has not been broken. Despite everything, Hamas has not disappeared. In fact, I would say the ranks of Hamas have swelled 1,000 times because of the atrocities committed against Palestinians. So in fact, Hamas is more popular than it was pre-October the 7th. Hezbollah has been seriously weakened by the assassination of its leadership, by the fall of Syria, but it's rebuilt. And this is a big worry. It's a big threat for Israel. And they can't kill an ideology. They can't kill an idea that says, your occupation is wrong. Your occupation is unlawful. The Palestinians have a right to their land. You have to leave because you're not legally on Palestinian territory. You're not legally on Lebanese territory. You're not legally on Syrian territory.
There is something that I'm wondering about it with this is the people in America are starting to question Israel. We've seen Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson from the right, we'd have associated with the right wing, talking a lot about Charlie Kirk and all this stuff. And Israel's losing popularity. Is it key to the Zionist project that they bring in Blair and Britain? Britain has to play a bigger role, a bit like in Iraq they needed Britain. Do you think that's at all significant that Britain has to give a kind of veneer of internationalism to the whole project that wouldn't be there without it? I mean, because it would really just be the US, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought that I hadn't looked at before. I mean, I would say what's happening in the United States with regards to Charlie Kirk, Candace Owen, Tucker, and so on, and there being some pushback against the Zionist movement rather than just Israel, because the Zionist movement is what has captured the UK, the EU, the US, not Israel per se. Israel is a component in the Zionist movement, a very important one, particularly regionally. I think as regards this region, I don't think, honestly, Israel really cares about what Tucker Carlson and so on are saying back in the United States. That might have an effect on US policy, although under Trump, I think that's extremely unlikely because Trump's administration is one of the most pro-Zionist or pro-Christian Zionist administrations we've ever seen, I think. And I think all of these rumors about there being rifts between Trump and Netanyahu are nonsense. I think they're just, again, like you said, the good cop, bad cop. It gives Trump plausible deniability from whatever atrocities Israel is about to commit. The peace scam, as I call it, for example, there's no ceasefire in Gaza. There's no humanitarian aid being allowed to enter, right? It's reduced the degree of mass murder, but it's still happening on an hourly, daily basis. It's still happening here in Lebanon, despite an alleged ceasefire that came into effect in November 2024, just before they pivoted to Syria and Damascus fell. I think Israel has violated the ceasefire here more than 600 times, as far as I know. And in the last few days, they've been bombing entire villages in the south under the pretext that they're Hezbollah safe houses. I mean, this sounds so familiar, right? It's exactly what they said in Gaza. Every single home was inhabited by Hamas fighters, and so they were obliterated. The same thing is happening in the south. People are not being allowed to reconstruct. They're bombing reconstruction factories like, quarries and supply factories for construction in the south. They're bombing bulldozers, they're bombing heavy equipment, they're bombing temporary homes for people wanting to rebuild their houses. They're not allowing residents to come back to their homes in certain areas in southern Lebanon. So it's exactly the same tactics. I think bringing Blair in, I'm not even sure how much credibility that's going to give, because I think he's more hated in the Middle East than Trump is. If you look at his record in Iraq and then posting him as Middle East envoy, people loathe him here. So I'm not really sure. I just think that's that's an indication of the importance of his role in what is going on, and the importance of his what is it, the Tony Blair Global Institute,
So do you
which has
actually
been,
think? So do you
sorry.
actually think? I'm just thinking. Do you actually think Tony Blair is a very significant player? He's not being used. He's actually an agent.
No, I think he's pretty significant in this, because if you go back, as I said, it was Blair and Bush that led the war against Iraq, unlawful war against Iraq, that was decided upon long before it actually was initiated, right, post 9/11. It was Bush and Blair that were communicating about giving Syria a chance to come on board, but if it didn't, they would unleash the insurgents against Syria. So Blair was instrumental in what is happening in the region, the breaking down of the region into statelets like we're seeing in Syria, and actually what was planned for Yemen pre-2015, when there was the pushback by the Ansarullah movement against Saudi Arabia, and the neo-colonialist movement, of course, behind Saudi Arabia, which was the US, Britain, UAE, Israel, etc. Yemen was destined to be broken down into sectarian statelets that would ensure the isolation of Ansarullah within central Yemen, right? So this was always part of the plan. If you go back to the clean break doctrine of 1996, which was effectively written by the CIA, commissioned by Netanyahu back then, the plan is to break the region down, isolate into isolated statelets that will be more open to Zionist influence and Israeli settlement. Exactly what they've done in southern Syria, with Jolani leading the attacks against the Druze in Sweda, to the point where the Druze are actually saying, you know what, it's better to be occupied by Israel than to be slaughtered by the tribal factions and the Takfiris under the control of Jolani. Of course, Israel is directing all of these events inside Syria to enable its occupation of the Druze territory in the south.
Wow. The thing that's also happened in the last month is the deprescription of HTS
Oh,
in this
God.
country. Now,
That's insane. Yeah.
what can you say about HTS that makes that decision seem wrong or just insane?
Well, it is insane, isn't it? So we're de-prescribing Al-Qaeda, because we have to remember that Jolani was he was originally with ISIS. He then left ISIS and was co-founder, along with his foreign minister and defense minister, of Al-Qaeda in Syria, which was known as Jabhat al-Nusra, Nusra Front in Syria, which was supported by the British, but from a clandestine perspective. Then they rebranded into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. So suddenly they're no longer Al-Qaeda, but they were still a prescribed organization under the Al-Qaeda umbrella in the UK. Now they're suddenly deprescribed, but Hezbollah and Hamas are still prescribed. Palestine Action is still prescribed. What should this tell people? about what the British government is doing. Hamas and Hezbollah are not a threat to UK national security. They're a threat to the Zionist national security. HTS is not a threat to the Zionist national security because Jolani was recognized even by his closest fighters in Idlib as being an agent of Israel. In fact, he had one of his close commanders bumped off because he started writing songs pointing out that Jolani was actually a Zionist agent. He wasn't, an ideologue or a caliphatist or anything like that. He was assassinated by thugs that were under the control of Jolani. And so the de-prescription of HTS, and by the way, the parallel de-prescription in the United States, because Jolani is effectively going to meet with Trump in the US on Monday, right? And they're going to be integrated into, I mean, it's so ridiculous. I feel like I'm living in a complete parallel universe sometimes. They're going to be integrated into the anti-ISIS coalition. But hold on a minute, he came from ISIS. So and most of his fighters are ISIS fighters or affiliated with ISIS. So how is this going to work? As someone pointed out, so is Ahmed al-Sharaa, which is his rebranding to enable them to take off the bounty on his head, going to be fighting against Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who was a member of ISIS? Do you see what I mean? It's crazy. But the most criminal thing is the prescription of a group like Palestine Action. So they're de-prescribing Al-Qaeda. So if you support the Takfiri ethnic cleansing of Christians and Alawites and Druze and Sunni moderates in Syria, that's fine. You can go on the streets and wave a Takfiri flag. That's fine under these rules. But if you come out in protest of genocide by the Zionists against Palestinians, you're supporting terrorism.
Yeah. Oh, so I mean, I looked at what the government ministers have said about the de-prescription, and they say it's to help cooperation on security, migration, and chemical weapons, and sort of taking the chemical weapons away. If they de-prescribe, they can have more of an input into getting rid of chemical weapons.
But hold on, Syria got rid of its chemical weapons in 2013, unless, of course, now they're saying they didn't, and it was the terrorists that had chemical weapons the whole time.
Oh, right. I mean but they just seem, but they seem to make statements on that kind of basis. But why do you think? It's an obvious question, but I have to ask it. Why do you think the Western media have said nothing about this de-prescription, and also are not commenting on what's happening in Lebanon at all, or Syria?
No, and very much not in Yemen or in Iraq. I mean, they're absolutely stum on most of this. Well, because the Western media, particularly UK media like the BBC, Channel 4, etc., were effectively an extension of British government policy and intelligence agency policy in Syria. So from the very beginning, they supported the Al-Qaeda and affiliated armed groups, many of which, by the way, probably 50 to 60% of the Takfiris under Jolani's control are foreign. So they're not even Syria. And they're being given positions of power in Syria. So they're from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Chechnya, they're Uyghurs from the Xinjiang province in China, etc. But they're mostly foreign. And these media outlets, The Guardian, for example, were promoting these armed groups as the moderate rebels, the legitimate opposition to a demonic government that, they criminalized from 2011 onwards as using chemical weapons, etc., etc. And so now, of course, what are they going to do? They're going to support British policy, British government foreign policy towards Syria, which is to de-prescribe HTS and to effectively support an Al-Qaeda government, despite the fact that it is still conducting these massacres and daily kidnappings and abductions of women from the Alawite communities and taking them to Idlib as Takfiri brides and raping them, etc. Right? That's still ongoing. But now the media is not reporting on it.